Well, the East India Company had been given its position initially. The reason why you wanted to grant a monopoly to a company is the government itself didn't have the funds or the means or the political capital to do these things on their own. So if a bunch of merchants come to them and say, well, we'd like to explore trade with the East Indies, and since we're going to be putting in all the risk to do this, if we succeed, we'd like a monopoly on all future trade with this region, right? Because the whole thing could go pear-shaped and fall apart and collapse in their faces. If that happens, then the British government can kind of wash its hand of it and say, well, you tried. It wasn't us. It was a bunch of private merchants. And then if it succeeds, then it's going to pay off for that company forever. So in the 17th century, the English government said, all right, this seems like a fair bet to us. And so 170 years later, right, the East India Company is still a monopoly. It's become deeply imbricated with the British state in a number of ways. A number of members of parliament were stockholders in the East India Company. The East India Company was probably the second most important financial institution in the British Isles after the Bank of England itself. And so if it were to collapse, large sectors of the British economy might collapse with it. So and obviously the East India Company had been a source of tax revenue for the British government. You didn't want that to just go away. It had been a source of wealth in a variety of other ways because of the economic and commercial profits that the company had generated. So So really, the simplest way of explaining it is that by 1773, the British government believed that the East India Company was too big to fail. It couldn't, just as with the banks or the auto companies over the past few years, this was an instance where the British government really felt that it couldn't just allow the East India Company to collapse. It could try and tighten regulatory controls over the East India Company. It could say, well, you guys just can't be wild cowboys over in India anymore. We need to pull the reins in on you a little bit. But it couldn't just allow the entire thing to collapse. It was at that time the East India Company was thought to be too important. Over time, the East India Company will be made part of the British government. That is going to happen over the next few decades. But at that moment in 1773, the British government wasn't willing to completely absorb and nationalize the East India Company, but it also didn't feel able to let it collapse.